Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Woohoo! Now we're live. Vad snyggt det blev med PASSIM-bilderna i liofärgerna. Det var en läcker touch. Eva,
Vadå?
har du sett här att vi har fått PASSIM-bilderna i liofärg?
Nej. Bara det att vi har fått bilderna är ju helt sensationellt.
Mycket.
Vad heter det? Maten kommer vid 4. Om du kan hjälpa mig att hålla reda på. Jag tror att jag har rätt dem eller koden. Så de kan ta sig in själva och bara dumpa där. Men eventuellt kan man behöva springa ut eller någonting. Och Gustav kommer lite sent. Men han har koden och jag har sagt att det bara går in och liksom sätta sig. Okay. Men det där med maten kan vara bra om du hjälper mig att hålla lite koll på.
Nu finns det en tweet från PASSIM som man kan retweeta.
Ska jag retweeta den?
Det tycker jag.
Det är bra, du säger åt mig annars. Nej, nu har vi fått här. Nu har jag fått en massa. Ja, precis. Och EC har lagt upp oss igen nu.
Har de?
Ja, de har
Det är
som
bra.
ett ögonblick, men jag fattar inte vad det är.
Ja, det förra kunde jag se, men de försvinner ju.
Jaha, de gör det bara för att det är
Så
så
det var
snabba.
därför du inte... Ja, precis.
Ska vi se, nu ska jag retweeta. Men var är den någonstans? Alltså, ursäkta, det här kan jag bli. Var är den? Det är där jag ska retweeta,
Ja,
eller?
den är...
Inte så bra om man har på ljudet.
Nu gör...
Fortfarande liksom så riktigt basic.
Alltså, precis. Ja.
Pia är min känd på retweeta. Gustav snika in sen.
Testa om chatten funkar eller för att se om den har kommit in. Test.
Jag kan inte kommentera, jag är inte involverad. Men ja, du har skrivit det. Ja, men då så. Perfekt.
Ja, du har kommit att du hade bäddat in den på sidan.
Jo, men här har jag öppnat den på YouTube-kanalen. Så att jag har den här också. Allt ser alltså toppen snyggt ut.
Ja, strålande.
Vi kör om 5 då. Det är 5 minuter kvar. Så att, det är lite fördröjning på växeln.
Låt den gå.
Nej, det är väl inga... Ja, jag har försökt att gå runt.
Och sen ligger den ligger uppe nu.
Ja.
Så att vi får lite miljöljud.
Ja, jättebra.
Men när det är dags så kan vi gräva.
Ja. Det får väl bli lite improviserat. det vi saknar från oss då? Hanna på ingång kanske. Gustav är på ingång. Så det är bättre att ha det på. Ja, men det är nog på ingång. Gustav ska komma.
Det är YouTube som räknar ljus.
Ja, ja, precis.
Du kan sitta där, tror jag.
Men jag
tror inte det
tror
finns
att
något
den borde
problem
kunna se
med
det
det.
ändå, men jag vet inte.
Det är Jesper.
Nej, tjena.
Ja, men då.
Tjena.
Tjena.
Redo?
Så är det.
Redo?
Ja,
Härligt.
absolut.
Väldigt förberett idag.
Ja.
Det var jag själv visste.
Nej, du borde jobba med musik också då.
Ja, precis. Det är ju tisdag. Ja.
Du kan ta en sån här bild när man gapar med munnen så här snyggt.
Du testar den här bara. Det är fram och tillbaka där, va?
Ja, just det. Den där
Exakt.
ser jag också.
Precis.
Det är höger, vänster bara.
Och när du är färdig så kan jag ta den.
Ja.
För,
Ja, just det.
Får jag testa bara?
Nej.
Får jag komma ut hit så ska du ta lite steg ditåt. För nu får du närmare projektorn i halva ansiktet istället. Nästa bild.
Ja.
Just det. Ja, det var säkert, just det. Det var Anna som twittrade ut. Vi hade en från Umeå som han håller på med. Han är konstnär bort, men han håller på med speldesign.
Jaha, okej. Som är på Humla, eller?
Ja, precis. Och då kommer man ner och pratar. Vi har som små, liksom, vi kallar det för techfik. Alltså det är mindre grupp och inbjuden gäst, så gör man någonting så att lite mer än ett seminarium. Och då var det ett designade spel. Det gjorde vi faktiskt. Och lyssna. Han berättade hur han tänkte kring det.
Ja, kul.
Så, nej, det var kul. Nej, men det går
Du
bra.
rullar på där.
Ja, det är lite... Ja, det är väldigt många trådar och bitar som rör sig samtidigt. Och försöker liksom få bygga upp någonting av värde. Men jag tycker att vi ändå har lyckats med en del grejer.
Ja.
Fått
Men
igång
ni har kickat igång verksamheten?
Ja, visst. Sen är det klart att det är under utveckling.
Ja,
och det kommer det ju vara ända tills...
Process.
Ja, alltså det här är ju liksom 2 år man hinner komma igång precis. Men sen är tanken att det ska gå att få till någon fortsättning på det kanske.
Var ligger det liksom?
Vi har det är ingen stor lokal. Det är liksom, rummet är väl i den här storleken ungefär. Det ligger under, alltså det är Engelska parken och ett hus som ligger nära den här humanistteatern.
Ja,
det är samma hus som ABM som är vår institution.
Okej, så det ligger på, det var det jag tänkte, institutionellt till, det finns en institutionell tillhörighet.
Ja, det finns det, men det är finansierat och det är viktigt så vi försöker att...
Kör vi om 30 sekunder för jag kan ge dig tecken när det är dags att börja.
För det är lite viktigt, därför att vi ska ju vara gränsöverskridande och tvärvetenskapliga, uppmuntra det och då...
Okay, welcome everybody. Those of you attending here today, this seminar, and those of you who might be attending online. My name is Eva Hemmungs-Wirtén and I'm professor of mediated culture here at Linköping University. I'm also the PI of the project, of the ERC-funded project, Patents as Scientific Information, 1895 to 2020, or PASSIM. I'll be chairing today's event with the assistance of my sidekick, Mattis Karlsson,
who has done much of the preparatory work for this event, which is a first for us. I mean, we've never done a webinar, so fingers crossed, everybody, that this will be running smoothly. Now, this is not the time nor the place to go into any more details about the project itself. Asian age, questions of public knowledge in patents, etc., is really evolves or is constructed around 3 historical periods. Now, everybody knows that dividing things into, now it's moving by itself. Dividing things into historical periods is a tricky thing, and of course very much a construction. But the project, having quite a long time span, is divided into 3 historical periods. The first is from 1895 to 1936, which we call from bibliography to documentation. The second is 1937 to 1970, which is documentation to information. And the last one, is more contemporary, and that's 1971 to today, which we have defined as from information to data. All of these 3 periods are also associated with particular media technologies. So the first one is the index card, the second one is microfilm, and the third one is the screen. And today we look at one of these technologies, and that is microfilm. In Microfilm Law and Scientific Information is the first of a series of seminars or webinars that we intend to hold during the lifespan of the project. And the background is as follows, and I'll be very, very brief. 2 years ago, I was faculty opponent on Mats Lindström's PhD thesis, Drömmar om det minsta. And I've been meaning to get Mats here to the department for quite some time, and it's very typical that it takes 2 years from the initial time when you think you're going to do something, and then it takes forever to get it done. But as it turned out, José Bellido, one of the researchers in PASSIM, presented a few ideas around microfilm last fall when we had a project meeting in Canterbury. And it sort of struck me at that time that these 2 people, one from law and one from the history of ideas, really should get together and talk about microfilm. And we might all benefit from it, as it were. And that's why we're here today, because of, I think there's a lot to talk about. Certainly within PASSIM, there's a lot to think about in terms of microfilm. Now, so this is today's seminar. I just want to say that this fall in September, we'll be hosting the first of 3 workshops in the project, parts of which we'll also be sending out live. And the first workshop, we have 3 workshops scheduled for the lifespan of the project again. And the first one will take place here in Norrköping in September. And it focuses on interdisciplinary, I think I've formulated it as the experience of doing research on intellectual property as an interdisciplinary work or as an interdisciplinary endeavor. And it will be followed by 2 more workshops, 2020 on patents as capital and value, and 2021 on patents as in war and peace. And we also have a final conference coming up in 2022, which is entitled Patent Futures, a History. And all of the information, all of the outputs that we have in PASSIM is posted on our website. And that goes for our articles. The first one is out now, also for the workshops and also for the seminars as the one today. So I just like to say follow us on our website, follow us on Twitter, and please ask questions during this broadcast or during this seminar, of course, through the YouTube channel and through Twitter. And we've done as follows. So the first speaker is Mats Lindström, who will be followed directly by José. Then we will give our speakers time to sort of interact with each other, or if they have any thoughts or ideas on their respective talks. And then, of course, we open up for the discussion with the general audience. And, of course, during that entire time, people that are, watching this or on the YouTube channel. So, without further ado, Mats, please.
Yes. So maybe we should remove this one. So, thank you very much for having me here. And I'll just get started. As was implied by the folder advertising today's PASSIM event, to most people, microfilm is an obsolete and anonymous technology. It is aging or even dead. Oh, let's see. Yeah. Associated with failing machinery and dark newspaper reading rooms in libraries. Or alternatively, it is perceived as an almost forgotten medium of concealment and espionage, belonging to the lost era of Cold War spies. But during the 1930s, at a time when commercial and more standardized techniques for microfilming first became available in Europe and the United States, it was recognized as a new and exciting technology, belonging firmly to the future, potentially even perhaps replacing the book, like with this ultra-modern 4-year-old who is using a microfilm reader in 1938. So, before microfilm got stuck, so to speak, in the libraries, it attracted dreams of new forms of distribution and production of knowledge. So today I will be discussing some of these dreams and anticipations or imagined futures, focusing on how this technology was expected to change the conditions of knowledge production and management of scientific information. I will be saying a few words about Paul Otlier and his early interest in microfilm, and then move on from the European context to discuss the American Documentation Institute and Watson Davis and Robert Binkley, two perhaps lesser known American proponents of microfilm. Hopefully this will provide some background and useful starting points for the discussion afterwards. But before I continue, I should first say something about what microfilm is, or perhaps what it was, and also something about the longer history of microphotography. So, what is microfilm then? Well, microfilm is a peculiar medium in the sense that it doesn't obviously come with any content of its own. To my knowledge, there has never been an aesthetics of microfilm. No theorized artistic language or any great masters of the medium. There are no narrative works associated with microfilm. It would seem, a purely archival technology. Microfilm has, however, and as I've already implied, inspired fictions and grand narratives about itself and how it would change how information could be produced, stored, and managed throughout society. Perhaps it is these fictions, these archival fever dreams, that provide the real content of microfilm. But as much as microfilm is an archival medium, it is also a medium of technical reproduction. Typically, it reproduces printed media such as books, blueprints, and technical or bureaucratic documents. At this technical and material level, the content of microfilm is always other media. Its essence, if any, is that it always operates on other media through reproduction. So clearly, the medium is the message, And we also have here a great example of remediation in the words of Bolter and Grusin. Importantly, though, the optical process of microphotography also dramatically reduces the documents that it reproduces, and stores them on small strips of film, and in some cases on cards. From this point of view, microfilm can be understood as a technology of miniaturization and spatial management, or perhaps even as a cultural technique, a kulturteknik of reduction and compression. Adding these observations together and referencing media scholar John Durham Peters, microfilm could perhaps even better be understood and described as a logistical medium. That is, a medium or technology which manipulates space and time by operating on the capacities of other media and objects. So to conclude, I would say that microfilm is a logistical technology for managing space through the optical reduction and reproduction of other forms of media. Microfilm is also a medium with a history which is perhaps surprisingly long. The first process for photographic miniaturization of documents was invented in the 1840s and 50s. These early microphotographs, however, were meant for entertainment and spectacle. They were novelty items containing small fragments of text, portraits, or scenic images, which could be viewed through a strong magnifying glass or a microscope. In an English language context, these objects were often called stanhopes. And here we see some examples of such novelty items and entertainment microphotographs. And here are some more. It wasn't until the early years of the 20th century that microphotography was more generally interpreted and re-evaluated as a technology for optimizing space and for managing the production of information. An important starting point for this re-evaluation of the medium around 1900 is Paul Otlet, by many considered a sort of forefather of modern information science. At the turn of the last century, this Belgian pacifist and bibliographer started to form the so-called European documentation movement, with the explicit aim to index and classify not only every available printed work, but every atomic fact that was accessible to human cognition. Working with the chemist Robert Goldschmidt, Otlet experimented with microphotographic camera and projection machine. He declared this new technology, which he called le bibliophote, one of the key enabling components of his great vision of a transparent and rationally ordered future. Microfilm, according to Otlet's visionary anticipations, in conjunction with immense card catalogs and worldwide networks of specialized knowledge workers, would provide the material infrastructure for a new utopia. A new utopia of universal and complete information. Now we lost the image. We're not in the utopia.
Dystopia.
Dystopia. But here it is, because this is one of Otlet's famous schemas or diagrams showing the process of universal documentation. And it's a bit hard to see, but at the bottom here you can see that microfilm is sort of makes out the part of the material base, if you will, of this great endeavor here, the bottom of it all. So again, and this is my sort of historical argument here, in the early 1900s, microphotography was uncoupled from entertainment and popular culture and increasingly associated with the management and production of information. Or to put it differently, it was perhaps for the first time interpreted in terms of infrastructure, as a scientific medium belonging to libraries and archives, rather than the domain of amusement and optical toys. But while Otlé was an important actor, he was certainly not the only one, especially if we move forward a few decades on the timeline to the 1930s. So I will now turn to the American context and the 1930s and two influential proponents of microfilm in the context of academic publishing and scientific information. Watson Davis, who was a popularizer of science, and Robert Binkley, a historian who was well known for his interest in new technologies of documentary reproduction. Both of these men were associated with an organization called the American Documentation Institute, which was partly inspired by the European documentation movement and Otlé. And both argued that microfilm possessed the potential to radically change traditional academic publishing and how scientific information would be produced and managed in the future. So starting with Davis, what was his interest in microfilm and which problems were he hoping to solve? Well, according to Davis, many of the problems associated with scientific information were intimately related to the material and economic conditions of the academic publishing industry. He argued that the ever-growing amounts of specialized scientific information aimed at small audiences of experts were ill-suited to the economies of scale that ruled the publishing business. This, in his assessment, meant that most scientific articles had to be condensed, or even worse, rejected. Data thus would tragically be lost because they couldn't fit within the physical limits of printed scientific journals. Davis was, however, convinced that the disadvantages of printed media could be overcome through a successful application of microfilm technology. In 1937, the American Documentation Institute was founded with the explicit goal of creating a centralized storage facility for scientific data with microfilm as the enabling technology. So the aim of the American Documentation Institute was to sort of act as a cache or store for unpublishable or out of circulation works of science. The basic idea was rather straightforward. Editors and authors would be encouraged to send in unpublishable and rejected manuscripts for microfilming and storage at the Institute. Abstracts would then be published together with information on how to obtain complete articles. And through this new infrastructure for lost scientific information, articles and whole monographs could then be distributed through the postal system, cheaply and on demand, either in the form of microfilm rolls for reading machines or as photographic prints on paper. In a speech delivered in 1938 to the American Special Libraries Association, Davies envisioned the role of microfilm in the global media landscape, placing it side by side with radio, telephone, telegraph, and the global postal system. Microfilm was, in his words, the missing link, not only within academia, but within the modern communication system as a whole. By connecting the libraries of the world through cameras, microfilm strips, and reading machines, they would, according to Davies, eventually merge into, I'm quoting him now, merge into one world library without loss of identity or individuality. Failing to complete this mission, Davies warned, the intellectual world will have missed one of its greatest opportunities. So, Davies's problem was directly related to the specific materialities of printed journals and books. Understood as containers and carriers of information, journals and monographs were spatially limited. Or to give it a different, perhaps more Shannonistic or Kittlerian reading, seen as channels of communication, their bandwidth were not wide enough to cover the ever-growing output of scientific information. So this was a spatial and material problem, and also what I would call a problem of failing circulation, failing logistics of knowledge. And the solution was to employ the powers of spatial manipulation and reduction of microfilm to, I suppose you could say, create a sort of recycling center or machine for scientific information waste. Nothing would be lost. The historian Robert Binkley, also associated with the American Documentation Institute, had similar ideas about the limits of print media and the merits of photographic reproduction, including microfilm. In a text called New Tools for Men of Letters, he attacked what he perceived as a centralized and monopolistic publishing industry and the, quote, print fetishism of his conservative academic colleagues. Binkley, however, projected that the printed book would soon be, in his words, superseded by the film slide, and argued that microfilm possessed a radical potential to democratize the access to knowledge. In a print-based infrastructure for scientific information, there was no room for local amateurs, according to Binkley, only for professional experts with access to the publishing industry and to the large university libraries. Through microphotographic publishing, access to literature and sources would be decentered, while the monopolies of publishers and large institutions could be broken, creating a new era for local and free research. Microcopying, Binkley wrote, offers the reader a book production system more elastic than anything he has had since the 15th century. So, to Binkley, as to with Davies, the basic problem with modern scientific publishing was related to the basic material conditions, the paper and print of the academic system. And to both of them, microfilm seemed like the obvious solution. Microfilm presented itself as an alternative to old information infrastructures that were centered on the book, print technology, and the failing materialities of paper. So to conclude and wrap this up, while microfilm today is mostly associated with archival preservation of documents or newspapers, microphotography started out as an optical toy and entertainment medium. By the beginning of the last century, however, it was uncoupled from entertainment and started to be interpreted as a revolutionary means to change the conditions of scientific information management. In the 1930s, microfilm presented itself as the techno-scientific future of academic publishing. It would solve problems of information loss and distribution within the domain of science that could seemingly never be overcome without moving away from the materiality and spatial conditions of paper, the print fetishism, as Binkley called it. As a technique for reducing documents and managing space, microfilm operated, it seemed, on the very materialities of scientific information. Microfilm was, in essence, anti-paper, and it promised to become the material basis for a new logistics of knowledge. So, microfilm may be dead today, but in the 1930s it was not only still alive, but the very image of vitality. Through speed, lightness and flexibility, it would overcome the bulk and heaviness of paper media. It would serve as the backbone of a new and modernized academic infrastructure in which scientific information would circulate efficiently and almost without effort. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mats. Thank you, Eva, and Mattis, and all PASSIM members, and people who are connected. My talk is related to microfilm, not only as a medium to reproduce patents, but also as a medium to think about patent history. This is relevant because, as Brad Sherman has recently observed, patent history is a subject that is still largely waiting to be written. And it stems from a general theme in PASSIM itself that is mainly the legal relationship between documentation and communication in patent history. What would the history of patents look like if, instead of looking at inventors and scientific or technological developments, we focus rather on patents as technological artifacts or as tools of documentation and communication? Such a history would appreciate the ways in which patents have been historically written, numbered, read, and reproduced, and the distinct paths in which they have been sorted, stored, circulated, copied, and sold. Such a history would move the peripheral to decode the many ways in which patents have been or could be coded to be searched, retrieved, examined, watched, and or litigated. In that sense, it is important to raise the question, as Eva has raised, of how patents become or became documents, but also that of how documents became patents. Media effects precipitated the way in which the legal forms such as patents emerged. As Potage has noted, inventions were first communicated in the form of models, and the shift from models to paper might be characterized as the historical key for the invention, forgive me the pun, of the patent specification, a paper item, which was arguably the driving force behind the constitution of modern patent regimes to be invented. The agency of paper and stationery was, and still perhaps is, central to many of the operations around patent law. And it is possible still to recall how devices such as color clips define domestic patent offices, like the British one. When the librarian of the British Patent Office talked about the organization and handling of patents, he highlighted the importance of paper keeping to put in order, stamp, shelf, paste in amendments, and organize the sets. For binding, we have a gallant team of 2 senior paper keepers, both ladies, and 5 paper keepers. Media technology, from paper to the digital, raises questions about the ways in which patents have been processed and construed. And it shows how patents could be, at the same time, both legal documents and sources of technical information. There is plenty more, of course, to say about the importance of media for patent history. And whereas the history of patent documents digitization has been the object of close attention recently by HIO, and can be traced to the EPO, the first patent office which did not have a patent register in a traditional form of books or file cards, but rather on a computer. What has not yet received proper scrutiny are the early attempts to standardize, process, and convert patent files into microfilms that took place in the second half of the 20th century. So my question now is, why a microfilm? Different factors made the history of microfilm in patents particularly remarkable. First, microfilm histories sit uneasily in the transition from documentation to information that Eva has introduced, between preservation and exploitation, between public and private, between openness and secrecy. Microfilms were neither documents nor databases. Microfilm offer many promises, for instance, of storage and dissemination, which have largely been superseded. Precisely because microfilms do not facilitate a history of origins or a history of success, but conversely, but quite the opposite, because they occupy this middle neglected or ignored space, they are particularly interesting for historical reflection. What were the changing circumstances that brought microfilms or microforms into patents, or patents into microfilms? Why, and more importantly, when microfilms did acquire substantive epistemological prevalence in patent history? A cursory glance through the main patent journals shows that the use of microfilms by patent offices on a significant scale began in the 1940s. Although no substantial switch took place until the 60s or even the 70s, these early discussions, the 40s, are interesting because they show different situations in which microfilms prove efficient and economical. A concern over record survival rose particularly during and after the war, when a number of libraries were damaged, with the result that patent files in Japan, in Germany, and Britain were destroyed. Microfilming came to be seen enthusiastically as an important way to invest in preservation strategies to secure patent records against those dangers. Copies of patent documents could be then preserved off the premises as an insurance against war, fire, and other dangers. However, as might be apparent from what I have already said, microfilm activities were not yet office supplies. They did not initially cover the whole patent file. They were limited to a very specific type of document, patents already granted. In other words, microfilming did not extend to patent applications per se, as it was deemed to be an inconvenient medium without the proper equipment. Microfilming did not become part of the operations through which an invention was institutionalized or examined, and from which the legal form could be emerged. By distinguishing between grant and application, the first use of microfilms in patent offices was restricted both temporally and spatially within the internal workings of the office. Such a distinction is interesting because it is a reminder of the distinction between records and files. After the Second World War, microfilm activities covered patent records, but not patent files. While it might be interesting at least to me, to open here a parenthesis and come back to Cornelia Bisman's book on files that has this discussion on the transition from records to files. I want to move to the late 1950s. That is another decade in which microfilm in patent offices, microfilm activities were acquiring more and more prominence. Almost 2 decades later, in the late 1950s, discussions over microfilm in patents resurfaced again after the medium had broadened its media technological conditions. These discussions were, however, triggered by different factors. Rather than record preservation, another attribute of microfilms, attracted patent offices. In the midst of a space and paper crisis, and taking into account what one patent barrister once said, that the real problem with patent specifications was that there were an awful lot of them, patent documentation suffered not only because of the fragile quality of paper, but also because of its massive quantity. Microfilms appear then not as a method of paper preservation, but mainly as of paper reduction. Microfilming, it was claimed, reduced paper to about 2% of the original volume, and bureaucratic institutions like patent offices were seduced by such a promise, since it offered a solution to one of their constitutive problems. Microfilms, in their different physical forms, jacket, roll, fish, and card, became increasingly present in patent offices, and the role was somehow upgraded from storage spaces to the office itself. It is obvious that underpinning those shifts, functions, and managerial decisions to miniaturize information and reduce patent paperwork, there are histories that could be told. One, for instance, that might explain how patent offices try to save costs and decentralize their operations. In fact, the decentralization of offices and the creation of patent centers or libraries was facilitated precisely by the portable nature of microfilms. Although some scholars express concerns over the security problems of patent information reproduced in pocket material, microfilms, the fact that copies of patents granted and applied for could be microfilmed meant that many patent offices, instead of sending patent gazettes, began to direct reels regionally to their centers and internationally to other patent offices. So I guess the tendency to universalize information is also present here. The potential reproducibility of the medium, key for such a disseminating move and for the development of patent networks, also prompt unexpected problems. Perhaps the main problem generated by the spread of patent information was that the law entered into a referential relation to itself and rapidly precipitated discussions over rights that could be either infringed or acquired after accessing the information contained in these microfilms. Ironically, the question that some courts were called to answer was whether or not patent applications on microfilm constituted prior art. The question was important because some domestic patent statutes expressly noted that printed publications were the only information capable of destroying novelty. So the doctrinal question was, is a microfilm a printed publication, and therefore is it capable of destroying the novelty of your new patent application? Leaving this interesting doctrinal question aside, the point to observe from these cases is how pervasive microfilm patent applications had become by the late 1950s and throughout the 1960s. This material had reached the Library of Congress in the United States and many reading rooms in patent offices across the world. It is precisely that special room, the reading room, where microfilms proliferated. As a room open to the public, reading rooms were important because not only did they materialize the patent bargain, but they also instituted a different public for patents. Patent applications were not only destined to be read by examiners, but also by the public. It's a whole discussion of what is the audience of a patent, whether it is the examiner or the public. Is both. And the existence of reading rooms is an example of how you can infer that the patent application or patent documents have multiple audiences. When applications were microfilmed and reading rooms were equipped with machines to read and print those images, readers, both individuals and corporations alike, quickly began to see patent information as an available resource. Copies could be done on the spot, or roles could be acquired without delay, nuisance, or complications. So patent information could be organized in different ways to cater and construct different markets or publics, such as patent departments, patent agents, scientists, etc. For instance, as a result of the implementation of microfilming, the US Patent Office was reported to be providing copies of 7,000 patents per day in 1960s, and 20,000 per day a decade later. What made microfilms different from previous paper copies was that they were truly a transfer technology, giving access to a mass of patent information in a faster and more portable manner. Unsurprisingly, this process opened a debate over the ownership of that information. Although the question of copyright and microfilm legality had been raised in previous forums, for instance, at the Royal Society Empire Scientific Conference in the 1940s, when microfilm patent applications were at stake, some other issues came into play. For instance, the tension between public access to information and private reappropriation of scientific information. In some countries like the United Kingdom, crown copyright existed in patent documents, and hesitations as to whether allowing private companies to make a business out of patent information initially applied. It is not a coincidence that the early beginnings of patents and scientific information providers, such as the Institute of Scientific Information or Derwent, were characterized by a similar attempt to overcome copyright problems either by negotiation, litigation, or settlement with patent offices. So the beginnings of the Chemical Heritage Foundation, Derwent, and any patent provider was either a contract with patent offices or litigation or settlement. That is my impression, or at least what I have found in a couple of institutional archives. In any case, one of the interesting effects of microfilming patents was that they paved the way for an industry that saw patent information as its product, and the informational dimension of patents conveyed by microfilms had some significant implications. While it is possible to see here some configurations of private industries into public spaces, Kodak, for instance, getting into the US Patent Office, the point to be made here is more modest. It is just to observe how microfilms facilitated additional ways for patents to function as an informational resource. Microfilms maintain an interesting relation to patents as documents because their photographic properties easily allowed certified copies to be produced. So I think the photographic quality that microfilms had, or some sort of similar to a photocopy, was very useful to not very distinctive in producing certified patent documents or copies that are identical and that can be checked as identical. Microfilms maintain, but they also help to automate, speed up, and enhance patent operations. Microfilms allowed offices to quickly share copies of their patents with other countries. That standardization and automation became salient issues in patent offices around the world, was an effect of the circulation of patent information that took place in the second half of the 20th century, mainly after microfilm activities. For instance, an international group of experts, ICREPAT and IMPADOC, they were both formed in the 60s and in the 70s to create information systems in connection with the handling and searching of patent applications. And the first products that ICREPAT and IMPADOC were providing, they were microfilms or microfiche. By the late 1960s, microfilms had become part of the administrative machine of patent offices in order to fulfill reference, copy, and search demands. All issued patents in the US Patent Office were on microfilm, as they were a complete set of indexes covering original classifications and cross-references. Orders for copies were made from microfilm copies too. That means that a patent document running to as many as 8 pages could be reduced to a 2-inch rectangle of 35 millimeters film mounted into a punch card. Further attempts to introduce microfilms as an essential part of the patent examination process also emerged. I think the distinction that I am trying to make here is these microfilm patents already granted or applications for patents, but whether they could be also part and parcel of the examination process itself. That is, before any, for these operations to take place, the grant, whether microfilm could be a useful medium itself, and not only for publication or for reference or for copy. Following modernization plans that affected patent offices, the value of microfilm was not, according to some managers, merely in the reduction of patent records. The real savings came from the use as a tool to simplify and advance all patent operations and routines. In 1968, the National Bureau of Standards in the United States published 2 studies that tested the response of patent examiners to the use of microfilm in their everyday activities. Microfilm had been acknowledged as a popular medium, not only for the storage, but also for retrieval and processing of patent files. One of the significant problems that microfilms were asked to solve was the dispersion of reference material threatening patent file integrity. When examiners and readers perform patent searches, patent files in use were not available for others to consult. In other words, both the examiner and the searcher had to do some searching in areas beyond their desks. And microfilms came to be seen as a way to set up a policy designed to alleviate or to minimize such problems, as they permitted simultaneous use of patent files. This made it practical to let each examiner have his own individual file of the patent classes assigned to him. Although today this sounds like a naive and obvious characteristic of patent routines that were overcome by databases, to know what the status of your application could be at this precise moment, it was a significant breakthrough at the time. The National Bureau of Standards went even further and became interested in the effect of film polarity over patent examiners. Such interest was prompted by the resistance perceived in patent personnel to changes for the ways in which the office operated. So obviously, any bureaucratic institution always find the resistance to change the routines by which operations are being made, and microfilm found that resistance, that people did not want to move on to microfilms at the beginning, or patent examiners. 2 studies were conducted over a period of 4 months. The first experiment was conducted with 12 examiners from the mechanical unit and constituted a pilot study to consider the effect of film polarity, in the search time incurred by examiners. So they were the time that it took them to search the files was measured. The second study, carried out with 30 examiners from the mechanical, chemical, and electrical units, concluded on the preference of positive over negative film. What made these studies interesting was their attempt to evaluate the performance of the human-machine interaction. Firstly, they recorded the number of seconds that examiners took to locate reference numbers in the microfilm. Secondly, the experiments tried to measure eye fatigue of patent examiners while examining microfilm patent applications. While these early attempts to automate the patent office were criticized later by information entrepreneurs for being primitive, they were innovative in their attempt to develop management tools and to create an information system that began to resemble the patent system that we have today. For instance, it is here where we can see the on-demand fast copy production system and the significant pressure to make files readily available to the public. It is here where an incipient information industry repackaging patent information to provide so-called value-added services also emerged. It is here also where we can observe patents being conceived as a type of mechanized information, as a step before they began to be converted into data. Thank you.
So is this okay? Can I stand over here? So thank you both. Maybe you could first react to each other's talks, and then we'll take it from there. If you have any question to each other, I mean. Or...
So my first thought is that you were talking, at least you mentioned the agency of paper, and you were talking a lot about the agency of microfilm, and I think this is maybe a good starting point. I mean, what does these different materialities do with the knowledge workers or the people who engage with them, and how do they explain the ideas and the expectations that form around the medium? I don't know if this is a question, but more of a observation. I think this is important. And obviously they thought it was important as well, as they had to sort of study this. You know, what does microfilm do with the eyes of our patent examiners, right?
Yeah, I guess the agency, or the at least as how I see it, is a step forward to change different ideas of what is actually the work of the patent office. So that's for me the most interesting ingredient in this history. Perhaps it's not the microfilm itself, but what is the effect of microfilm, of people thinking about what is the work that they should be doing, or what they are doing. It will be perhaps that's what agency is the effect of, or the triggering mechanisms. But I was very interested in some of your discussions as to that I didn't think when I was writing this about the differences between microfilm and paper, and whether it was a logistical medium and perhaps completely different from other type of medium. And I was interested because one of the things that I haven't mentioned was the particular awkward relations or difficult relationship of microfilm with the law that I haven't mentioned here, that is about microfilm being presented as evidence in courts, microfilm laws in different countries, and I'm not so sure about how that is a different medium as such from paper or broadcast or so perhaps the whole distinction of the medium is already giving an ontological or essential quality of the medium itself. I don't know if I'm making sense in the question, but is that attempt that you had at some point of distinguishing microfilm and giving microfilm a unique perhaps character, and that it made me reflect on.
I think my point was that microfilm is sort of slippery in this sense. I mean, it's a medium, like I pointed out. It's a medium which has been used en masse had different functions throughout society for a pretty long time, and but it always contains other media, right? And in general, these other media, it's paper, right? So there's always this relationship between the optical process, the film roll or cards or whatever, this ability to reproduce and reduce what has already been printed on paper. So there's always this relationship between paper and microfilm, and so sort of microfilm. I mean, I suppose my point is that this is from the point of view of media theory. I think microfilm is perhaps the most McLuhan-esque of all media, right? It's like it has no content. It only contains other media. But then, of course, microfilm, this is not true because it has these specific agencies. Mm-hmm. And the people who sort of got excited about microfilm, they were talking about these agencies. I mean, these qualities. It's not heavy. It's light. It's fast. It's quick because you can and you can mechanize it in different ways compared to paper, etc., etc.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think the discussion that we had before the seminar was interesting. I was asking you, do you make a distinction between microfiche, microfilm, the typical roll, aperture cards? Because I think at least in patent offices that made a difference. Yeah. And I think aperture cards or microfilms, what you will find in a jacket, and then you read it, I think it was in one of the images, was more interesting than the whole roll. So the whole rolls were more for preservation, storage, and the microfiche in a jacket had much more. It was something in between the paper card. It could be more user-friendly for the everyday operations of the office, and that's. I thought that was the chronology that took place here, but I don't. You were telling me. I think these are much more complicated than a teleological.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. It's not teleological because you had cards early on and you had rolls early on, etc., etc. And they've been applied for when you need cards, you use cards, and when rolls are useful, you use them. But first of all, I mean, the cards are film as well, right? Mm-hmm. It's always film. So, but when you say microfilm, you think about the rolls, but the cards are also film, right? So, but there are, of course, differences between the fiches or cards compared to a roll. I mean, the roll is continuous. it's like a tape, like a cassette tape or something like that. Well, the cards can be, they have random access basically. You can, the pages, the pieces of information on the cards are discrete. So they're easier to reference and search, and for that reason probably much more useful, quicker to use at the patent office, for instance.
That's great.
So this is an important sort of material difference between the roll and the card. But they're all film, right? Because this is the chemical process and the storage medium. Is a film that you can throw light through it and create a projection. So, but I'm not sure about your. What was that your question?
Yeah, I mean, I think you clarified that. I think perhaps the whole microfilm is already too general. At least if you are writing a history of the use of microfilm technologies in plural in patent offices, there's a need to make these distinctions between microfiche, microcard, or microfilm in rolls, because I think they actually fulfill different functions, and there is an internal differences of the media itself that help some of these functions to be met, or demands to be met.
Yes, and there will be, of course, a technical development throughout this history of microfilm and patent offices, because it's not only a question about if they use cards or rolls or whatever. I mean, it's also a question about the surrounding technologies. And you mentioned that at some point, and this was probably when it really became useful to patent offices, you could create these aperture cards, I think they're called. So you have basically a punch card with a slide or like a piece of microfilm mounted in the card. And then you have digital media on paper, and you have analog photographic media on film combined, and you can sort of use your IBM computer or whatever to create databases and mechanically and digitally process this sort of Frankenstein medium. So when new technologies become available, of course the agencies changes, and this would affect the work process at the patent office.
Do you think, I mean, there's, when you were talking about problems and solution and the logistical way of characterizing microfilm, does it make it, I think in my view as a lawyer, is a really juridical medium that is, it makes the whole existence, like the whole existence of the law will be to provide, or an attempt to provide solutions for problems or conflicts or disputes. Yeah. So when you were talking about this logistical way of defining microfilm, my question was, is that a legal, juridical form in which there is no, perhaps the content is irrelevant, but what is the operations, what the law does is to operate, but is...
I'm not sure I get the distinction, but I don't think there's. I can try and answer this question like this. I don't think there is. I was talking about this microfilm as a medium which is sort of, in some sense, very open. It contains other media and it's logistical. It sort of affects other media. That's the whole point of it. But of course, as I always also tried to make clear, when microphotography was sort of invented, or in its early history, it was primarily something that was used for fun or something like that. Look here, we can make this image really, really small, and then you can look at it in this optical device, and you can suddenly see this dot to the eye. It turns out to be like a whole bunch of portraits or a picture of a very large cathedral or something like that. And this use is completely different, of course, from the use at the patent office, or the sort of logistical, informational use that I was talking about. Because what happens in the 1900s is that this technology, which was already present, is sort of reconfigured or something like that. So suddenly it's taken out of the entertainment context, and it's sort of, hey, we can use this to solve problems of space that are created by paper, and we can solve problems of distribution that relates to both time and space that are also created by paper. So the whole point of microfilm, from that point on, basically, is to solve the problem of paper, or the different problems of paper. So it always acts logistically, in some sense, on paper media. So that was sort of the point that I was trying to make.
I was wondering if we could open up for questions from the audience, or reactions, or whatever. We have a few questions coming in from various places, but please, questions, thoughts, ideas to either of to both of the speakers at the same time, or whatever. Yes, you.
Thank you very much for both of your presentations. I was wondering whether...
Sorry, you need this.
Okay.
Still being a rookie.
So thank you for both of your presentations. I'm still intrigued about the relationship between film and the paper. So sorry if I'm returning to this. In a way, it seems to me that the microfilm is a reproductive medium. So without the paper, the microfilm has nothing to take a film off. Yeah. So in the specific context of patents, after the microfilms were made of existing patent documents, was the official status, did that lie with the microfilm or with the original paper document that was microfilmed? So in a way, I'm interested in, was the paper the original, or was microfilm complicating the idea of original and copy? Thanks.
I think that's for you.
Yeah, I think it's I agree that is the paper might be the requirement for microfilm to operate, but the point I was trying to make in my talk was about files. I mean, a file is not a paper. That was the whole point. So the file is not a piece of paper that is being microfilmed. It is something that began to be composed of different papers, and the whole discussion was it would be possible to microfilm at the same time as papers are being filed, and that would be microfilm getting into the examination process itself. So not just microfilming patent already granted, that they are useful for novelty searches, obviously, because the first database, the first thing that you will be looking as a patent examiner is previous patents that have been granted to see whether the new application is new. Not also for patent applied for, that it will be not only for patent gazettes, that it will be patents applied for, still not yet granted, that will be distributed to different patent libraries for people to see whether they are interested in opposing that patent. That would be a different instance with different time, but also getting into microfilming all of this and then having a role or a fish that give patent examiners the possibility of examining and performing their operation. I think also some of the products like IMPA-Doc that we were discussing before are about putting different patent applications together in microfiche. So you have, yes, without paper there is no microfiche, but I think the microfiche gives you the capacity to compile all of this information, to arrange it into one fiche, something that will be a file on its own. So this family of patents.
Answer my question there, Jose. I'm wondering. So what is the official file?
What do you mean the official?
So if the application process is still open, and
no, I mean I think these experiments where, as I said, many information entrepreneurs like Monty Hyams, they said, oh, they really failed. They really failed because they couldn't automate the file and microfilm at the same time. But I think they indicated that tendency that then came later with databases, that there's something that can be done, like simultaneous use of the file, and therefore when you have microfilms of patents applications with different examiners using it in their desk, you have like different files, because what you are using are copies of the file. So there is no file. There are multiple files, multiple copies of the file being used by different. That is the same as if you connect to the database, SpaceNet. What is the file? I mean, we are 4 of us using the file because there is no file, but just a connection to a copy of the file.
But maybe related to this, the question of, because it's basically a question of authenticity, right? What's the real document here? What's the original and what's the copy? Well, I don't know. From what you've said, it sounds like there were discussions about this, and it was a problem that was discussed. How do we sort of establish this relationship between the authentic original and the maybe fake copy or something like that? But as a starting point, what happened, because so paper is always the content, right? Even in this case, but what happened with the paper? I mean, did they throw it away in these different settings?
It's coming back
or did
to
they keep it,
It's coming back to that idea of file integrity. That is, so instead of thinking of documents as a single documents, the idea is to think of an examination process that doesn't have a single document, but different searches, for instance, of previous patent applications that then will be citations or whatever a patent examiner will be. So you have searched previous patent applications and then you put them in the file. And then with the publication of the patent applied for, and then with the grant. Oh, yeah. So that will be, so instead of thinking of documents, patent document, single document, the idea, what microfilm, I think they were thought of being useful for, is that many patent searchers, they wanted to see that file as it was being compiled. And obviously, a patent examiner said, "Okay, give it back the file to me." Yeah. And then other patent searchers, they were saying, "Oh, the other guy from Glaxo is checking that file." So that idea of file integrity is something that microfilms were useful, and it's not about, I think, authenticity of the document that it is presumed, but it's also about the file being used simultaneously, because there are copies what you are searching. You are not searching originals, you are searching copies.
Exactly, because you're the expert on patent history here, and I know hardly nothing. But just to make it clear, so when someone works with patent searches, they are basically they have received an application, right? Someone says this is patent worthy, this is original, this is new. And then the patent searcher goes through the archive, so to speak, looking for prior art. Mm-hmm. And then they need to sort of go through old patents, copy them, and compile them as a sort of... So microfilm would sort of be... It could be used for creating this sort of trace or path through the archive, right?
Yeah, I think the whole IMPADOC was family of patents. Yeah. That is, the idea was, for instance, you have an invention being filed in the UK and the same invention being filed in France, so that the microfiche or the IMPADOC services were to put in a document a family of patents by which you can figure out what is a patent strategy of a corporation, for instance. So that is why I'm not sure about authenticity. I think there is a lot of discussion about authenticity in courts. But the question of what is a microfilm in the cases that, I mean, I didn't mention the names of the cases, but in the 60s, in Re Tenley, in the 60s, was some microfilm reels or rolls were sent from the German Patent Office, for instance, to the Library of Congress. As a scientist, you were searching this material, obviously, and then the patent examiner in the US said, oh, this person has checked these German patents in microfilm. So,
it's not good enough.
And they said, and the opposition, the lawyers, smartly enough, they said, it's not a publication. These microfilms are not printed publications, that is what the legal requirement requires for destroying novelty. So that's what I was saying about how the law becomes referring to itself in a very interesting way. This has been overcome and superseded in 2 decades in which microfilms have been considered to be publications. But I think at some point that was what the judges were also struggling to make sense of what is the what type of publication, if it was a publication, a microfilm was. It's like similar like a conversation. Is that capable of destroying novelty or not?
I'm going to hand over the mic to Jesper, but I have one quick question from Matthias Klang, who is at Fordham University in the state. And he asks, and he talks about users, and of course you have multiple users here. It might be patent offices or patent examiners or whatever. So you pick whatever user you feel most comfortable with, I guess. Did the users develop strategies to work around the microfilm, or were they evenly accepted? Or in other words, what did the resistance to the technology look like, if there was any?
So should I start? Well, there were different kinds of resistances to different types of microfilm introductions throughout the last century, I suppose. In my research, I look at a period when there really isn't a lot of resistance. They're all excited about this technology, and my main focus is really about the ideas, and I have not been looking deeply into the practices like you do. You look into the specific practices at some specific point of view. I've been more looking into, the ideas that were supposed to be implemented. But of course, there was some resistance at different points of time. I mean, one example we discussed, an interesting example, is that this great project of microfilming genealogical archival materials, which was bankrolled by the Mormon Church for religious reasons, basically all around the world. Or this was an early sort of endeavor that started in the 1940s and then went on for several decades. And it was done in Sweden, for instance. And in some countries there were resistance, but not against microfilming per se, but against this strange church. What are they doing with our archival materials? This is sort of so in some context this was sort of one kind of resistance or problem that brought up discussions. Should we really be doing this? Of course, then there are other kinds of resistances which are related maybe more to when it was actually implemented. You had an example of this. So they started using microfilm in patent offices, and then they sort of, let's do studies to see how efficient it is, and what about eye fatigue, you know? So when you sit in front of a reader, a screen for a whole day, and it's light, it's not paper, you know, what happens with the eyes? Is it you know, ergonomic? You know, these kinds of studies were made, and there were discussions. Yeah, I don't have really a general, you know.
Yeah, I think in reading rooms in patent offices, the tension became of allocating time to searchers to use the machine. So I think that there were established rotas. Also, it happened with computers that there were only 2 microfilm machines. So you could book a specific allotted time to be able to access patent information. So there was some resistance as to obviously the equipment and whether there was a possibility to perform the search. I think what we were discussing before about some of the commercial providers of information like Derwent, they created users groups, and the way they were testing their technology and their services was getting feedback from. So there were even conferences and meetings in which people who were using this material, they were saying, "Oh, it doesn't work. That's what we want." So some of these patent information services based on microfiche or microfilm, they were changing as the users said, "Oh, we want now the chemical patents in." So they were user-driven to some extent.
Okay, I'm Jesper Olsson. I'm a professor here at Linköping University in literature and media history mainly. And thank you so much for two really interesting presentations. I have several questions, but I'm going to stick to one, I think, to start with at least. And you began, Mats, by calling microfilm a dead medium, I think?
Yeah.
You said it, yeah?
Of course it's not, but...
yeah, and since I have used it myself, you know, when I worked I went to the library in the 90s and early 2000s as well, when I did my research for my PhD and so on. I want to ask something about its afterlife, or its life today. And my main question, I think, is it possible to consider microfilm a residual medium today, you think, in comparison with like vinyl or cassette tapes or something like that? And if we do so, if it approaches like a residual medium in Raymond Williams' meaning him, what can we learn from the media practices that you mentioned talked a little about, Jose? And if you could say a little more about the actual media practice that were developed around the technology in the post-war period. Was there, for example, any attempts to do art with microfilm? Was there any attempts to turn the technology into like a commercial commodity, or like in comparison with the tape recorder, for example? And did that produce any media practices that we can learn something from today when we approach media in a digital ecology every day, you know, with like search and retrieve and the editing of media materials and so on. So in that regard, what can we learn from the microfilm? Mm-hmm. I mean, you invited this question, of course.
Yeah.
Because, so, but a little more about the practice. You talked a lot about the ideas, the utopian ideas from the 30s, but the practices. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that was my first question, at least. Thanks.
Okay, so if I start, did it develop commercially? Yes, of course it did. I mean, obviously. The technologies.
Like an individual.
Yes. Yes, there were sort of. Commercial endeavors. Companies started in the 30s in the United States mainly, where the idea was to, publish literature on well, basically, I think they were cartridges, basically, which were filled with, I don't remember, it probably was a roll. And then machines, so that you could sort of, you had your machine, and then you bought, you know, Herman Melville or something like that, and you mounted it in a machine, and you projected it or read it on a screen. And this, as far as I know, it failed completely, you know, because probably, so maybe this is an example of resistances, you know. It didn't work out commercially, you know. You couldn't sell microfilmed literature to people because they preferred paper in this case. Of course, at libraries and patent offices and archives, the situation was different. There you could sell it. So that was one of your questions. Then about art, there's one sort of example that I know about. I can't really remember his name now, but one of the American sort of modernist poets.
Bob Brown.
Yeah, Bob Brown. Yeah, I mean, was not really microfilm per se, and it was sort of, he never really implemented this. Though I think he's sort of, well, I think he tried, but he had this idea about creating poetry. It was not really on film strips. It was actually a micro print, so high resolution print on paper, and then you would use some kind of optical device to roll it in front of your eyes. And he sort of theorized this from an aesthetic point of view, and even I think he even, you know, wrote poems that were made for this device. But that's as far as art goes, at least to my knowledge. There were also some really early proposals in the 20s and patents made, I think, for this kind of eye-mounted reader. I think probably Bob Brown read about this, but that was not, you know, for artistic reasons, but it was for, you know, you could have an encyclopedia and access it in this way. So not really art, but maybe some kind of, you know, content that was properly belonged to micromedia in some sense.
I think the commercial question is interesting because the most interesting case on microfilms and copyright went up to the Supreme Court in the U.S. That is Williams and Wilkins, and it's about libraries. So it's about whether what microfilming is an infringement of copyright or a defense, or a educational defense. And some of the discussions in the Copyright Act in the mid-20th century were about, should we establish a defense for libraries, or is that a commercial activity? So it was a publisher like Elsevier. It was Williams and Wilkins versus the U.S. government, and the library was the National Library of Medicine. And then in the U.S. as well, they introduced an exception to copyright for microfilming itself, for microfilming the presidential papers in the Library of Congress in the 60s. So there was a need to tweak copyright laws for some of these microfilming activities or projects to take place. I think one question that I wanted to ask you is related to this. I think this microfilm also triggered this idea of a project to, like, digitization projects that I think is like a business plan or a project to change the whole face of the institution that I think is interesting itself. So this is not just the medium, but also it's okay. Let's change and let's do all of this with our documents, and that idea is also very capitalistic on its own. Like this business plan of projecting to the future, all of this change of logistics or organization.
So, and there was also the question of is it some sort of residual media? Yes, of course, in many ways. I mean, it's still there, of course, because one of the points of microfilm is that it preserves. So there are lots of microfilmed archives, you know, somewhere just lying around in case something happens, you know. Then, of course, microfilm has been useful for some digitization projects. For instance, patents, I believe. I mean, this is sort of, I actually never thought about this, but this is my book, and as part of the... Yeah, so these are patents. There are a few of these.
Can I comment actually on that? I was telling someone earlier today that if you go into I was telling Johanna, if you go into there's a coffee shop chain in Sweden called Espresso House, I think. And as part of the decoration of all espresso houses, you have patent specific or patent images on the walls. Yeah. So I think it's quite interesting that patent documents are beginning to be used, you know, as decoration in public spaces because they're beautiful, because they are aesthetically appealing.
Absolutely.
So I was thinking about that when you had that in your book, that's the way people mostly meet patent specifications today, on the walls of the espresso houses in Sweden when they're having a cup of coffee. But so just a parenthesis.
But this is sort of there are a few of these patent images in my book, and they are, of course, we sort of found this. They are related to microfilm technologies, of course, but. And they are taken from Google's patent database, of course. Sure. But the thing is that these are of course microfilms as well, right? I mean, Google has been digitizing microfilm patents. I mean, if you look at them, you can sort of see it. They're very, you know, they're just black and white, very contrasty and stuff like that. So that's I suppose an example of, you know, residual microfilm.
Yeah, and I just can comment on that and what Eva said here. That image is very evocative. It's very and it's also, you mentioned also that there's no aesthetics of microfilm really, something about that. But you have like posts like Bob Brown that you also talked about, of course. But there's also the whole aesthetics of bureaucracy and the office in 20th century art and literature. Where you find a lot of resonance with the microfilm that kind of technologies and the kind of practices that the technology initiated. So I think there's a huge aesthetics around this field or this like.
I would agree. I mean, the technologies are presented in a very aesthetic way. My point was there is no sort of theorized aesthetic, of course. Maybe.
Might be.
I'm going to hand over to Björn.
I'm Björn Hammerfeldt. I'm part of the PASSIM project, and I have my background in library and information science, so that will also, my question will be in that direction. But first of all, thank you for a great presentation and a very lively discussion. So most of what you presented here, and I think it's mostly for you, Mats, this question is about trying to control existing knowledge. So you try to control it in different ways and make it smaller so it's easier to handle. But I got interested in also when I read your thesis about Watson Davis, because he also uses microfilm as something to extend knowledge. So it's not like stemming the flood, it's like making the flood bigger. And do you have something more to say? Because it relates quite well to, I mean, I'm interested in scientific information, so the open access movement and these kind of preprints is very similar. So what happened to his idea? Was he totally neglected by the scientific community, or did he have a success?
You're talking about Watson Davis and
Watson Davis,
yeah.
Because
no, I mean
parallel is quite
the institute. As far as I know, it's continued. It functioned, and they sort of implemented these ideas, but it was not as successful as he imagined, and it sort of petered out maybe in the 60s or something like that. So I mean, in some ways, these ideas of using microfilm to extend knowledge and sort of change how scientific information was handled and produced were implemented, but they never managed to dominate in the precise ways that this sort of that was the utopian ideas intended. So I suppose that's my sort of loose answer about that particular about Davis and the institute. But when you were, I think it's a good point, you know, that this is not only about reducing and preserving, it's also about distribution. I mean, and proliferation actually. So there's some kind of irony here. So microfilm maybe produces more paper in some cases, you know, and it definitely produces more copies, right? Because it's, as I said, it's always a reproductive medium. So there's some original, and then you can create maybe multiple copies in microfilm, and you can create even more copies of that, and then you can sort of distribute it all around the world, maybe, and then then the world connects, and knowledge is extended and proliferated. So yes, absolutely, this was important. But I mean, in the end, I think this idea about microfilm as a sort of medium for connecting the world and extending and distributing distributing knowledge and sort of enlarging the scientific community, it's sort of petered out a bit, and then it more and more became this archival medium. It was used. It was something when it was commercially implemented. It was mostly for the libraries and for the archives and for the offices. Yeah. So that's sort of.
Okay. Thank you.
Can I make a comment on that
sure.
too, and on Watson Davis? I think actually that it's like Otle. You think that this was a great failure, right? Everything. So it's just a history of how these utopian movements fail. But if you look closer at it, you will see that Otle and Watson Davis, as a successor of Otle, were actually enormously powerful and influential, I think, in the later stage of the information era. So I think Watson Davis had a finger in quite a lot of interesting. I mean, he prefigures in some of the work that Isabelle has done, for instance. So I think there is this consensus that it's residual or failed, but I would say that maybe, these guys were far more influential than you actually would have thought. We have another question, one aspect that we have talked a little bit about, but not much, and this is from Victor Fröberg, and he asks, we've touched on it a bit, but we can talk about it some more. Were there ever any concerns from copyright holders that microfilm could be used as a medium of piracy? And if so, were there any attempts or suggestions to regulate the use of microfilm?
Maybe you have some comment on this.
Yes, the case that I mentioned is still very important. That is Williams and Wilkins versus the U.S. government. It's a case about microfilm. So the copies were microfilm. And also, if you take Hansard, the parliamentary discussions in the 1956 Copyright Act or any copyright act in the mid-20th century, there's a discussion of mechanical copies in which one of the forms is microfilm. So the discussion is, should we regulate mechanical copies? Yes, because they are decentralized. It is very difficult to find out where the copies come from. Should we establish a licensing regime by which we don't know how many copies have been done, but we can get some money out of the machines themselves. So there's parliamentary discussions on copyright and cases. What I think is, as I mentioned before, it was interesting is that the cases normally, or the ones that I have found, they targeted libraries and libraries as pirates, I guess, for the person who is suing them is pirates, and the discussion of what the microfilms are for, and libraries, their case is for educational use, and therefore they said you have to pay for that, and how much use of the microfilm. So they are interested in cases not only for what was the legal solution, but also how the law, how copyright law dealt with microfilm. I think it's also dealing with microfilm as a question of use, who is using that, who needs to pay for that, in a more contemporary fashion, and instead of looking at the copy itself. So what I mean is, instead of looking at the copy itself, as many copyright cases, the point that was being raised is whether there is a market there, and whether there is a market there, so therefore you are infringing the right. And I think that's also very interesting. If there is someone who writes a history of microfilm legalities, microfilm and copyright, they are useful to think how fair use in the...
I need
to sorry.
stop you there.
So that's the market point. The market point.
Well, we have to end. Thank you both for your talks and